The Martins thought they'd found the perfect home in Cedar Ridge, a peaceful neighborhood where they could build a new life. But from the moment they arrived, their presence stirred up tension with George, a longtime resident determined to keep things just as they were. What starts as cold stares and murmurs soon escalates into conflict, with vandalism, threats, and a community caught in the middle. As tensions boil over, the Martins face a choice. Will they stand their ground or give in to the pressure to leave? And what secrets lie behind George's hostility? Could the key to peace be hidden in the last place they'd expect? If you're curious about how this story of conflict, redemption, and resilience unfolds, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts. Would you stay and fight or pack up and go? The morning sun cast long shadows over the rolling hills as the Martin family's U-Haul rumbled down the winding road leading into Cedar Ridge, a suburban neighborhood nestled at the edge of town. Derek Martin, a tall, sturdy black police lieutenant, kept his hands steady on the steering wheel, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror, where his two kids, Samantha and Tyler, sat. Derek felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety swirl in his chest as they made their way through streets lined with meticulously maintained homes, each with a tidy lawn and a carefully painted fence. Karen, his wife, sat beside him, flipping through a stack of papers with their new address highlighted. Her dark curls framed a face etched with determination, but there was a softness in her eyes as she looked out the window. "This place is beautiful, Derek," she said, her voice filled with a quiet hope. "Just what we wanted, a safe, quiet neighborhood for the kids." Derek glanced at her, managing a smile. "Yeah, it's a fresh start, something stable." In the back seat, Samantha, 14, opinionated, and glued to her phone, barely glanced up as they passed rows of colonial-style houses. She had not been thrilled about the move away from the city, leaving her friends and her dance team behind. Tyler, on the other hand, was pressing his nose against the window, taking in every detail of his new surroundings. "Mom! Dad! Look at that house! It's got a treehouse in the backyard," Tyler exclaimed, pointing at a house on the corner where a wooden structure peeked through the branches of a tall oak tree. "Maybe you'll get to know those kids soon," Karen said with a smile, reaching back to tousle Tyler's hair. Derek's smile faltered slightly as he turned onto their new street, Cypress Grove Lane. The neighborhood looked picture perfect, but he knew that perfection often hid cracks beneath the surface. He just hoped they wouldn't find those cracks too soon. As they pulled into the driveway of their new home, a classic two-story with a white porch and blue shutters, Derek noticed a figure sitting across the street. The man, older, with a weathered face and white hair, sat on his porch with a newspaper in hand. He lowered the paper slightly as the Martins' truck came into view, revealing a scowl that deepened the lines etched into his face. "Looks like we have a welcoming committee," Karen said, catching Derek's eye as she nodded toward the man. Derek gave the man a friendly wave, but the old man, George Franklin, didn't return the gesture. Instead, he resumed reading, but not before casting one last, hard look at the newcomers. Derek's hand fell back to his side, and he forced a smile. "Just the typical nosy neighbor," he murmured, but inside a knot of unease tightened. They parked the U-Haul, and soon the sounds of moving filled the air, boxes sliding across floors, the scrape of furniture against walls, and the children's excited chatter as they explored their new home. Derek caught snippets of their laughter as Tyler chased Samantha around the front yard, and for a moment he let himself believe that this place might just be what they needed. By midday, the front yard of the Martins' home was a sea of boxes, each one labeled with Karen's precise handwriting. Derek wiped sweat from his brow, glancing toward the sun that was now directly overhead, turning the air heavy and still. Karen emerged from the house, dusting off her jeans. "We're making good progress, don't you think?" she asked, trying to keep the weariness out of her voice. Derek nodded, managing a smile, but he could see the fatigue in her eyes. The move had been tough on both of them, but they had pushed through for the sake of the kids. As they took a short break on the porch, a figure appeared at the end of the driveway. A woman in her early 50s, with short, curly hair and a warm smile, walked toward them, carrying a glass pie dish in her hands. "Hello there," she called, her voice cheerful. "I'm Angela Carter. I live just down the street." She held out the pie, which was topped with a lattice of golden crust. Thought you might appreciate something sweet after a long day. Karen's face lit up and she stood to greet Angela, accepting the dish with both hands. Thank you so much, Angela. I'm Karen Martin, and this is my husband, Derek. It's so nice to meet you. Angela's gaze shifted to the moving truck, then to the kids who were now unpacking boxes on the lawn. And your children, are those your two? Yes, that's Samantha, and the little one is Tyler, Karen replied with a smile. They're excited to be here. A little nervous, but excited. Angela nodded, her smile softening. That's understandable. Moving can be a big adjustment, especially for kids. I remember when my husband and I first came here 20 years ago. This neighborhood was different then, quieter in some ways. Karen caught the wistful tone in Angela's voice but decided not to press. Well, thank you again for the pie. We're looking forward to meeting more of our neighbors. Angela's eyes flickered toward George Franklin's house across the street, where the older man still sat, his face partially hidden behind the newspaper. Her smile dimmed slightly. Yes, well, I'm sure you'll meet everyone soon enough. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. And don't mind George too much. He's always been a bit set in his ways. With a knowing nod, Angela waved goodbye and headed back down the sidewalk. As Karen watched her go, she caught Derek's eye. I think she was warning us about him. Derek glanced across the street, where George still hadn't moved from his spot. Yeah, I got that impression too. Well, let's hope he's just a grumpy neighbor and not something more. That evening, after a long day of unpacking, the Martins sat down to their first dinner in their new home. The dining room was cluttered with half-open boxes, but Karen had managed to find their plates and a vase for the flowers that Angela had brought. Derek took a deep breath, savoring the smell of Karen's cooking and the gentle hum of the neighborhood outside. Here's to new beginnings, he said, raising his glass of iced tea. Karen and the kids clinked their glasses together, and for a moment, everything felt right. But just as they began eating, they heard a faint knock on the door. Derek exchanged a puzzled glance with Karen. I'll get it, he said, rising from his seat. He opened the door to find George Franklin standing on the porch, his face shadowed by the glow of the porch light. He wore a faded plaid shirt, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. Up close, Derek could see the hardness in George's expression, the way his lips pressed into a thin line. Evening, George said curtly, barely looking at Derek as he glanced past him into the house. You're the new folks, huh? Derek forced a polite smile, stepping out onto the porch. That's right. I'm Derek Martin. We just moved in today. George's eyes narrowed as he studied Derek, his posture stiff and unwelcoming. I see. Well, I've lived here for over 35 years, seen a lot of people come and go. We keep things pretty quiet around here. Respectful. Derek felt the unspoken warning in George's tone. We're just here to settle in, like anyone else. My wife and I are looking forward to being part of the community. George snorted softly, his expression skeptical. We'll see about that, he muttered under his breath. Then more loudly he added, just keep the noise down. Don't want any trouble. Derek watched as George turned and walked back across the street, his steps slow and deliberate. As he closed the door, Karen met him with a questioning look. What was that about? Nothing much, Derek replied, trying to keep his tone light. Just the neighborly welcome. Karen frowned, sensing the tension that lingered in his words. Should we be worried? Derek shook his head, trying to reassure her. Nah, let's just see how things go. It's probably nothing. But as he returned to the dinner table, he couldn't shake the feeling that George's visit was a sign of things to come. A reminder that their new life in Cedar Ridge might be more complicated than they had hoped. The next week passed in a blur of unpacking, grocery runs, and exploring the town. Karen enrolled Sam and Tyler in their new schools, and Derek reported to the local police department, where he was greeted with a mix of polite curiosity and guarded smiles. On their first Saturday in Cedar Ridge, Karen suggested they host a small barbecue to get to know some of the neighbors. It doesn't have to be anything big, she said, brushing a loose curl behind her ear as she flipped through a recipe book. Just a few of the people we've met, maybe some of the families from the kids' schools. It'll be nice to break the ice. Derek agreed, though he couldn't shake the memory of George's warning. Sure, it's worth a try. They handed out invitations during evening walks and at the grocery store, doing their best to be friendly and approachable. Angela, of course, RSVP'd immediately, offering to bring a potato salad. Tom and Jean Jensen, a couple in their 60s who lived 2 houses down, also agreed to come, though Tom's expression remained cautious. On the day of the barbecue, the Martins set up tables with food and drinks in their backyard. Sam and Tyler helped hang string lights, and the scent of Karen's ribs filled the air. A few neighbors trickled in as the afternoon sun warmed the yard, and soon the space was filled with chatter and laughter. But Derek couldn't help noticing the absences. George Franklin's porch remained empty, his house dark and uninviting. A few other neighbors who had seemed friendly earlier in the week suddenly had other plans. Angela arrived early, carrying her potato salad with a bright smile, but even she couldn't completely hide her unease when she glanced toward George's house. "Don't worry about him," she said quietly to Karen. "He'll come around, or he won't. Just focus on the ones who showed up." Karen nodded, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Thanks, Angela. I'm just hoping we can find our place here, you know?" Angela patted her arm kindly. "You will. It just takes time." As the evening wore on, the kids played tag in the yard, their laughter filling the air. Derek chatted with Tom about the local schools, and Karen struck up a conversation with a young couple who had recently moved down the block. But as the sun dipped lower, Derek caught snippets of hushed conversations, the way some neighbors glanced toward George's house with unease. He heard one woman murmur to another about keeping an eye on things and knowing who to trust. The words, though vague, settled heavily in Derek's chest. By the time the last guest left, the Martins were exhausted. Karen cleaned up in the kitchen while Derek took out the trash, listening to the sound of crickets filling the cool night air. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. The barbecue had been pleasant enough, but the underlying tension was hard to ignore. As he carried the trash bags to the curb, he caught sight of George's silhouette in the window across the street. The old man's face was partially hidden by the shadows, but his posture, rigid, watchful, sent a chill down Derek's spine. Derek turned back toward the house, forcing himself to shake off the feeling. "You're just being paranoid," he muttered to himself, but he couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety that had settled in his gut. Inside, Karen met him with a tired smile, pressing a cup of coffee into his hands. "It wasn't perfect, but it was a start," she said, trying to sound optimistic. Derek nodded, sipping the warm liquid. "Yeah, it was a start. But I think we need to be careful, Karen. George, he's not just going to let this go. He's watching us." Karen's smile faded slightly and she reached out to squeeze Derek's hand. "We'll handle it together. We're a team, remember?" Derek looked into her eyes, feeling the steady strength that had always grounded him. He managed a smile, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Yeah, together." But as they went to bed that night, Derek lay awake, staring up at the dark ceiling, wondering just how far George would go to make sure things stayed the way he wanted. The next week brought colder weather, with a chill settling over Cedar Ridge that seemed to seep into the Martin household. Derek noticed that some neighbors who had seemed friendly at the barbecue now avoided eye contact when they passed by on their morning walks. Karen mentioned that a few moms at the school drop-off had grown quieter when she joined their conversations. "It's like, I don't know, like they're waiting for us to do something wrong," Karen confided to Derek one evening. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in a blanket as the autumn leaves rustled in the breeze. Tyler and Sam were inside working on a puzzle together. Derek nodded, glancing across the street where George's porch light cast long shadows on the sidewalk. "George is planting seeds, I think. He's trying to make us seem like outsiders, like we don't belong here." Karen shivered, resting her head against Derek's shoulder. "But why? We haven't done anything to him." Derek wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out. We've faced worse than this, haven't we?" Karen smiled up at him, a flicker of warmth in her eyes despite the worry. "Yeah, we have, and we'll get through this too." But as the wind whispered through the trees and the shadows deepened, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that their new life in Cedar Ridge was already slipping out of their control, and that George Franklin wouldn't rest until he had turned the entire neighborhood against them. As the autumn leaves fell and the air turned crisp, Cedar Ridge slipped into its quieter season. For most residents, it was a time for bonfires, pumpkin carving, and preparations for the holidays. But for the Martins, it became a time of mounting pressure and unease. One Saturday morning, as Derek was washing his car in the driveway, he noticed George across the street, talking animatedly with Tom Jensen and another neighbor, Linda Martinez. The three of them stood with their arms crossed, their expressions tight. George pointed toward the Martins' house more than once, and Derek could feel their eyes on him. Derek tried to ignore the knot of frustration twisting in his stomach. But when Linda abruptly walked away, shaking her head, and Tom gave Derek a tight-lipped nod before turning back to George, Derek's patience began to wear thin. Later that day, Angela stopped by, her expression unusually serious. "Derek, I thought you should know. George has been saying some things about you and Karen." Derek's hands stilled on the rake he'd been using to gather the last of the fallen leaves. He turned to face Angela, his jaw tightening. "What kind of things?" Angela hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "He's telling people that you're bringing trouble to the neighborhood, that your kids are rowdy and that you're intimidating folks because of your job. He's even hinted that you might be using your position at the police department to scare people." Derek felt anger rise like a fire in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even. "That's ridiculous, Angela. You know us. You know that's not true." Angela put a hand on his arm, her expression sympathetic. "I know, Derek, and I don't believe a word of it. But there are people who do. People who've known George a long time, who trust him." Derek swallowed the bitterness that burned in his throat. "Thanks for telling me, Angela. I appreciate it. I don't understand why he's doing this." Angela's eyes softened with a mix of pity and frustration. "George doesn't like change. He never has. And when he sees someone new, someone different, he thinks it's a threat. But I'll keep an eye on things. And if there's anything you need, you know where to find me." As Angela walked back down the sidewalk, Derek watched her go, feeling the weight of George's accusations settling on his shoulders. He knew that the rumors wouldn't stay contained for long, that they would spread through Cedar Ridge like a shadow. Over the next few weeks, Derek and Karen felt the subtle shift in the air every time they left their house. It started with small things. Neighbors who had once smiled at them now glanced away quickly, muttering to each other as they walked past. The kids came home with stories about other students whispering behind their backs. One evening, Samantha sat at the dinner table, picking at her food, her usually bright eyes dull. "Mom, Dad, do you think the other kids don't like me?" Karen's heart sank, and she exchanged a worried glance with Derek before turning back to her daughter. "Why would you think that, sweetie?" Sam shifted uncomfortably, twisting a strand of her long braids around her finger. "Some of them, they say stuff, like that we don't belong here, that their parents told them we're different." Karen reached out to squeeze Sam's hand, her voice gentle but firm. "You know that's not true, right? People sometimes say things they don't mean when they're afraid. But you belong here just as much as anyone else." Derek watched his daughter's downcast expression, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. He knew who was behind the whispers, knew that George was using his influence to turn people against them. But confronting him directly would only play into George's hands. Instead, Derek decided to speak to Tom Jensen, hoping to clear the air. He caught Tom one evening as he was walking his dog, the chilly air and the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. "Hey, Tom, got a minute?" Derek asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Tom looked hesitant but eventually nodded. "Sure, Derek. What's on your mind?" Derek took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Look, I know George has been saying some things about us, things that aren't true. I just want you to hear our side of it. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to be part of the neighborhood." Tom shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Derek's eyes. "Yeah, well, George, he's been around a long time. People listen to him." Derek's frustration spilled into his voice. "And you think that gives him the right to spread lies? To make us feel unwelcome?" Tom finally met Derek's gaze, his expression conflicted. "I don't know, Derek. It's not that simple. People here, they don't like change. It's nothing personal, but it feels personal," Derek interrupted, his tone hardening. "And I thought we were better than that." Tom winced but said nothing more. He mumbled a goodbye and hurried away, leaving Derek standing in the cold with a knot of anger tightening in his chest. It wasn't long before George's whisper campaign led to something more tangible. One evening, as the Martins were winding down for the night, the sound of knocking echoed through the house. Derek opened the door to find two police officers standing on his porch, their expressions a mix of discomfort and professionalism. "Evening, Chief Martin," one of them said, nodding at Derek. "We received a complaint about some suspicious activity in the area. We need to check it out." Derek felt a cold knot of dread settle in his stomach, but he forced a calm expression. "Suspicious activity? What kind of complaint?" The officers exchanged a glance, and the younger one cleared his throat. "Noise complaints mainly, but the caller, well, mentioned some concerns about unfamiliar people hanging around. Said it made them feel unsafe." Derek's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "This is my home, my wife, my kids. We live here. There's nothing suspicious going on." The older officer nodded quickly, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sure that's the case, Chief, but we have to follow up on every report." Derek stepped back, gesturing toward the quiet, empty living room. "Take a look. There's nothing to see here." The officers did a quick sweep of the yard and front porch before nodding their thanks and leaving. Derek watched their patrol car drive away, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He knew George had called them, knew it in his bones, and he couldn't shake the sense that this was just the beginning. When he returned inside, Karen was waiting, her face pale with worry. "What did they want?" Derek sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand over his face. "George, he called them on us, said there was suspicious activity." Karen's mouth tightened, and she took a deep breath to steady herself. "We can't keep letting this happen, Derek. We need to do something." "I know," Derek replied, his voice rough with frustration, "but I don't want to escalate things. We need to find a way to show the neighborhood who we really are, without playing into George's narrative." A few days later, Karen decided to host a second barbecue, hoping to undo some of the damage that had been done by George's rumors. She spent hours preparing food, setting up chairs in the backyard, and even putting together a small bonfire for the kids to roast marshmallows. But this time, the turnout was far smaller than before. Angela and her husband showed up, as did a young couple named Jason and Emily. But the Jensens didn't come, nor did Linda or most of the other neighbors. George's house remained dark, his porch empty. Karen did her best to stay cheerful, chatting with Angela and playing games with the kids, but she couldn't hide the disappointment in her voice when she spoke to Derek later that night. "It's like they're scared of us, Derek," she said, wiping tears from her eyes as they cleaned up together. "Like they think we're the ones causing trouble." Derek wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "We'll get through this, Karen. Somehow we'll make it work." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he truly believed them. A week later, the Martins received a notice in their mailbox about a neighborhood meeting to discuss recent concerns in community safety. Derek felt his stomach twist as he read the flyer. It was clear that George's campaign was gaining traction, and now it had become a public matter. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building near the park. Derek and Karen arrived early, hoping to speak with a few neighbors before things began. But the atmosphere in the room was tense, filled with murmured conversations and sideways glances. Angela sat beside them, offering a small smile of encouragement, but she even seemed nervous about what might happen. When the meeting finally started, George took the floor, his face set in a grim expression. "There's been a lot of talk lately," he began, his voice carrying through the room, "about how things have changed around here, about certain folks who've moved in and brought trouble with them." Derek felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What kind of trouble, George? Be specific." George's eyes glinted with a mean light, and he turned to face Derek directly. "Noise complaints, strange cars parked outside, police visits. That's not what we had before." Karen stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "We haven't done anything wrong, George. All we've tried to do is be good neighbors." George snorted. "Maybe that's what you think, but a lot of people here don't feel safe anymore, and I think it's time we address that." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Derek felt his frustration boil over. He stood, facing George with a steady gaze. We're not going anywhere, George. This is our home, and we have just as many rights to be here as you do. If you have a problem with us, say it to our faces." For a moment, the room fell silent, and Derek could see the uncertainty flickering in the eyes of some of the neighbors. But then Tom Jensen spoke up, his voice hesitant. Maybe we should all just try to get along. There's no need to make this into a bigger issue than it is." George shot Tom a look of disdain, but the tension in the room began to ease slightly. Angela nodded, adding, "Derek and Karen have been trying their best. We should give them a chance." The meeting ended with no resolution, but as the neighbors filed out, Derek noticed that a few of them paused to offer a nod or a murmured word of support. It wasn't much, but it felt like the beginning of something. Karen took his hand as they left the community center, her expression weary but hopeful. Maybe things will start to change now. Derek squeezed her hand, but he couldn't shake the feeling that George wouldn't give up that easily, that the real trouble was still to come. As the weeks dragged on, the Martins' situation grew more precarious. They found anonymous notes slipped into their mailbox with messages like "keep quiet" or "go back where you came from" scrawled in blocky, threatening letters. Their tires were slashed one morning, and when Derek called the police, the officers who arrived seemed more interested in questioning him than finding the culprit. Tyler and Samantha began avoiding the front yard, too nervous to play outside as they had before. Karen tried to keep things normal inside the house, but the strain showed on her face, and she began losing sleep. One night, as they sat on the porch in the dark, Karen turned to Derek, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What if we made a mistake, Derek? What if this place isn't what we thought it would be?" Derek felt a pang in his chest, hearing the fear in her voice. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. We didn't make a mistake. We belong here, Karen, and I'm not going to let George or anyone else drive us out." Karen nodded, but Derek could feel the uncertainty that lingered between them. He knew that their fight wasn't over, that it was only just beginning. The November chill settled over Cedar Ridge, turning the leaves to a muted brown as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. For the Martins, the physical cold mirrored the coldness they felt from their neighbors, the unease that had spread through their lives like frost creeping over a windowpane. Derek spent more time at work, partly to avoid the tension at home, but also to keep his mind off the sense of foreboding that had taken hold. One night after working late, he pulled into the driveway and noticed something strange. A small group of neighbors gathered near George's porch. George was speaking to them in low tones, his hands gesturing animatedly in the cool night air. When Derek stepped out of his car, the conversation stopped, and the neighbors glanced his way before quickly dispersing. As Derek locked the car door, George's voice cut through the darkness. "Thought you could just stroll in and make this place yours, huh, Martin?" His words were slurred, and Derek caught a whiff of alcohol in the breeze. Derek turned to face him, feeling a flash of anger. "I don't know what your problem is, George, but it's time you let this go. We're not going anywhere." George's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you're the hero here, don't you? Think you can make everyone forget what this place used to be. But people like you don't fit in. You never will." Derek took a step closer, keeping his voice low and steady. "I've put up with a lot, George, but this needs to stop. You need to stop." George laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Or what? You gonna call your friends in uniform? See how far that gets you." Derek's hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to turn away, walking back toward his house. He could feel George's eyes burning into his back, and he knew that the confrontation had only made things worse. When Derek stepped inside, Karen met him in the hallway, her face pale. "I heard everything. Derek, I'm scared. He's getting worse." Derek wrapped her in his arms, pressing a kiss on her forehead. "I know, but we're not going to let him scare us out of our home." As he held Karen close, Derek realized that the time for patience had passed. If George wanted to fight, then they needed to be ready to fight back. A few days later, just after midnight, Karen woke to a strange noise outside. She sat up, her heart pounding, straining to hear over the wind that rustled through the trees. There it was again, a faint, metallic clanging, like someone rummaging through their garbage bins. Karen shook Derek awake, her voice barely a whisper. Derek, someone's outside. Derek rolled out of bed, grabbing a flashlight from the bedside table. He crept to the window and peered through the blinds, catching a glimpse of movement near the side of the house. He saw a shadowy figure slipping away into the night, but he couldn't make out any details. Grabbing his coat, Derek rushed outside, but by the time he reached the backyard, the intruder was gone. In their wake, he found the garbage bins tipped over, the contents strewn across the lawn, along with another note. "You're not welcome here." The words, scrawled in shaky handwriting, sent a chill through Derek's veins. He took photos of the note in the mess, then called the police, knowing that this time he needed to create a paper trail. When the officers arrived, they took his statement but offered little more than vague promises. "We'll increase patrols in the area, Chief Martin, but without a witness or video, there's not much we can do." Derek's frustration boiled beneath the surface, but he kept his tone controlled. "I appreciate it, but you know this isn't just random vandalism. Someone is targeting us, trying to scare us." The officers exchanged an uneasy glance, then nodded before heading back to their patrol car. As Derek watched them drive away, he couldn't shake the sense that he was running out of options. George's vendetta was escalating, and Derek feared that if they didn't find a way to stop it, the next incident could be even worse. The tension in the air finally broke one gray, windy afternoon when Karen went to the grocery store. She was pushing a cart through the aisles when she spotted Linda Martinez and a few other women from the neighborhood gathered near the produce section, chatting in low voices. When they saw her, they exchanged awkward glances and turned their backs. But Karen decided she had had enough. She approached them, her heart pounding, forcing a smile. "Hi, Linda. How are you?" Linda shifted uncomfortably, barely meeting Karen's eyes. "Oh, I'm fine, Karen. Just busy." Karen took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "Look, I know George has been saying things about us, about my family, and I just want to clear the air. We're not here to cause trouble. We're just trying to make a home like everyone else." One of the other women, a brunette named Michelle, crossed her arms. "It's not just about what George says, Karen. It's everything. It just doesn't feel the same around here anymore." Karen's smile faltered, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. "We're not so different from you. We want the same things. A safe place for our kids. A community we can be part of." Linda finally looked at her, her expression softening. "I know you're trying, Karen, but George, he's convinced people that there's more going on than meets the eye. And a lot of folks around here, well, they listen to him." Karen's shoulders slumped, and she bit back a frustrated tear. I just wish people would see us for who we are, not who they think we are." Linda hesitated, then placed a hand on Karen's arm. "Some of us do see you, Karen, but George has been here for so long, it's hard to go against him." Karen nodded, blinking back tears. "Thanks for being honest, Linda. I hope that changes soon." She left the store feeling more isolated than ever, her hope for finding common ground slipping away like sand between her fingers. That night, Derek returned home to find Karen sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. She looked up at him, her face pale and drawn, and he knew she had reached her breaking point. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Derek," she admitted, her voice cracking. "We can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." Derek took a seat beside her, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. "I know, Karen, and I don't want to keep pretending either. I think it's time we confront George head on." Karen's eyes widened, fear flickering across her face. "You don't mean—" "I'm not going to do anything reckless," Derek said quickly. "But he needs to understand that we're not going to let him drive us out. We need to make it clear that we're not afraid of him." They sat in silence for a moment, the wind whispering through the trees. Then Karen reached out and took Derek's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Okay, but be careful, Derek. Please." Derek nodded, feeling a resolve settle within him. He had spent too long trying to be patient, trying to be understanding. Now it was time to fight for his family, no matter what it took. The next evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Derek walked across the street to George's house. He knocked on the door firmly, and after a moment, George opened it, his expression darkening when he saw who it was. "What do you want?" George asked, his voice flat with suspicion. Derek met his gaze unflinching. We need to talk, George. Enough of this back and forth. You're trying to make us feel unwelcome, and I want to know why. George folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. You really don't get it, do you? This place, Cedar Ridge, it's not for people like you. Never has been. Derek felt anger flare hot in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. I don't care what you think, George. This is our home now, and we're not leaving. No matter how many lies you spread or how many threats you make. George's face twisted into a sneer, and he stepped closer, his breath sour with alcohol. You think you're better than me? Think you can come in here and change everything? I've been here 35 years. I know what's best for this neighborhood. Derek's patience snapped. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping to a low growl. You don't scare me, George, but if you keep this up, you're going to regret it. For a moment, they stood there, inches apart, the tension thick between them. Derek could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, could see the glint of defiance in George's eyes. But then George's expression flickered with something like uncertainty, and he took a step back. This isn't over, George muttered, his voice wavering slightly. You'll see. Derek didn't respond. He turned and walked back across the street, feeling the weight of George's gaze on his back. But even as he stepped inside his house, the confrontation left him with a sense of unease. He had made his stand, but he knew that George's stubborn pride wouldn't let him back down easily. The following week brought a storm to Cedar Ridge, the sky churning with heavy clouds that unleashed sheets of rain. The weather seemed to mirror the turmoil inside the Martin household as Derek and Karen grappled with the aftermath of the confrontation. Then one evening, Derek received a call from Emily Franklin, George's niece. Her voice trembled on the other end of the line. Derek, I need your help. Uncle George, he's not doing well. Derek's stomach twisted. What do you mean, Emily? Emily's voice cracked with emotion. He's been drinking more, talking about how he's going to set things right. I'm scared, Derek. I think he's going to do something reckless. Derek closed his eyes, pressing a hand to his forehead. Okay, stay with him, Emily. I'll come over as soon as I can. He hung up and turned to Karen, who was watching him with wide eyes. George is spiraling. I don't know what he's planning, but I can't let him hurt himself or anyone else. Karen nodded, her hands shaking. Go, just be careful. Derek crossed the street in the pouring rain, arriving at George's front porch just as Emily opened the door, her face pale and drawn. He's in the living room, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Derek stepped inside, finding George slumped in an armchair, a bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. He looked up when Derek entered, his expression wild and broken. You, he slurred, you think you can take everything from me. Derek knelt down beside the chair, keeping his voice calm despite the fear coiling in his chest. I'm not taking anything from you, George, but you need help. Emily's worried about you. I'm worried about you. George laughed bitterly, his voice cracking. Worried about me? After everything? Yes, Derek replied firmly. Because no matter how much we've fought, I don't want to see you throw your life away. But you need to stop this. You need to let go. For a long moment, George stared at him, his eyes filled with a mix of rage and something deeper, something desperate and lost. Then he slumped forward, the bottle slipping from his grip and shattering on the floor. Emily rushed over, tears streaming down her cheeks as she knelt beside her uncle. Derek watched them, feeling a pang of sympathy despite everything. He had come expecting a fight, but what he found instead was a man who had been broken long before the Martins ever moved to Cedar Ridge. The rain continued to pour outside, beating against the windows of George's living room, where Derek, Emily, and George remained, caught in the aftermath of the confrontation. George had fallen silent, slumping deeper into his chair, his head in his hands. Emily hovered beside him, her expression a mix of relief and worry. Derek took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the tension settle heavily on his shoulders. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a faint, weary smile. Thank you, Derek, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I didn't know who else to call. Derek managed a small nod. You did the right thing, Emily, but he needs more help than we can give him right now. Emily's face crumpled, and she wiped away a tear. He's just so lost, Derek. Ever since my aunt died, he's been angry at everything, at the world, at himself. And then when you move in, he, he just fixated on you." Derek looked at George, seeing the shadows under his eyes, the way his shoulders trembled with the effort of holding himself together. For the first time, Derek felt a pang of pity for the man who had caused his family so much pain. But he knew that pity wouldn't solve the problems between them. He turned back to Emily. "You should see if you can get him into a program, someone who can help him work through this. If he's willing, I can talk to a few people, see if they can arrange something." Emily nodded quickly, hope flickering in her eyes. "Yes, yes, please. I'll try to get him to agree." George mumbled something under his breath, and Derek leaned closer, catching the faint words. I don't deserve any help." Derek's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "Maybe you don't think you do, but that doesn't mean we're giving up on you. Not yet." With that, Derek rose to his feet, offering Emily a reassuring nod before heading back into the rain. As he crossed the street toward his own home, he couldn't shake the sense that this was the lowest point they had reached since moving to Cedar Ridge. But maybe, just maybe, it was also the moment things could begin to change. Back at home, Karen was waiting by the window, her face pale with anxiety. When she saw Derek returning, she rushed to the door, pulling him inside before wrapping her arms around him. "What happened? Is he okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Derek held her tightly, pressing a kiss to her damp hair. "He's not okay, Karen, but Emily's with him, and I think he's finally realizing he can't keep going on like this." Karen pulled back slightly, studying his face. "And what about us, Derek?" "What happens now?" Derek sighed, leading her over to the couch. "Now we take it one step at a time. I offered to help Emily find some resources for George, but he's got to be willing to accept them. And as for us, we keep pushing forward." Karen nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I'm just so tired, Derek. Tired of feeling like we're fighting everyone just to prove we belong here." Derek cupped her face in his hands, his voice gentle but determined. "We're not alone in this, Karen. I spoke to Angela and a few others. They wanted to help us. We just need to trust that things can get better." Karen closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try. For you and for the kids." Derek kissed her forehead, and they sat together in the quiet living room, listening to the rain ease into a light drizzle. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One that gave them a glimmer of hope after so many dark days. The next morning the storm had cleared, leaving the neighborhood washed clean under a pale, wintry sun. Derek went to work, but not before stopping by the local diner where he often met Angela for coffee. She had called him early, sounding more determined than he'd ever heard her. When Derek arrived, Angela was already waiting in their usual booth, stirring sugar into her coffee with quick, anxious movements. She looked up as he slid into the seat across from her, offering a tight smile. "I heard about what happened last night," she said quietly. "Emily called me." Derek nodded, leaning back in the booth. "Yeah, it was rough. George needs help, but I think he's finally willing to listen." Angela shook her head slowly, a frown creasing her brow. "It's about time. He's been hurting himself and everyone around him for too long. And the rest of the neighborhood, well, I think they're starting to see through him." Derek raised an eyebrow, feeling a flicker of surprise. "What do you mean?" Angela leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A few of us have been talking, Linda, the Jensens, and a couple of the younger families down the street. They're tired of George's fear-mongering, and they want to make it right with you and Karen." Derek felt a weight lift off his chest, but he kept his voice cautious. "I appreciate that, Angela, but it's not just about us. George has been hurt too. We need to find a way to make sure he doesn't feel like he's losing everything, or this will just keep happening." Angela nodded thoughtfully. "I think you're right. But maybe if we all work together, we can show him that change doesn't have to be something to fear, that there's room for him too." Derek considered her words, then smiled for the first time in days, a real, genuine smile. "Let's give it a shot. It's worth trying at least." That evening, Derek and Karen invited Angela and a few other neighbors over to their house to discuss what had happened and how they might move forward. The group gathered around the Martins' dining room table, sipping tea and sharing tentative smiles. Linda, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, glanced at Karen with a guilty expression. "I'm sorry, Karen. I should have spoken up sooner. I let George's words influence me, and I regret that." Karen gave her a small, forgiving smile. "It's okay, Linda. We all make mistakes. But what matters is where we go from here." Tom Jensen cleared his throat, his voice gruff with emotion. "If George is willing to get help, maybe we can focus on bringing the neighborhood back together. Show people that we can be neighbors without all the fear and suspicion." Derek leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I agree. And if we can get George involved, even just a little, it might help him feel like he still has a place here. He's scared of being left behind." Angela nodded, her expression determined. "I'll talk to the folks I know, see if we can get them to come to a neighborhood gathering, something small, just to start rebuilding trust." As the group made their plans, Karen felt a sense of warmth spreading through her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt since they first moved to Cedar Ridge. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step toward healing. 2 days later, Emily came to visit the Martins, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes hopeful. "I talked to my uncle," she told Derek and Karen, sitting at their kitchen table. "He's agreed to see a counselor, as long as it's someone who understands what he's going through." Derek nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "That's good to hear, Emily. It's a start." Emily hesitated, then looked down at her hands, her voice cracking with emotion. "He's ashamed of what he's done, but he's too proud to say it. He thinks it's too late for him." Karen reached across the table, squeezing Emily's hand. "It's not too late, Emily. We can help him find a way back, but he has to be willing to try." Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know how to make up for what he put you through, but I hope someday you can forgive him." Derek placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, his voice gentle. "We're working on it, Emily. And if he keeps moving forward, maybe we'll all find a way to forgive each other." As Emily left, Karen turned to Derek, a small, hopeful smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Do you think this could work, Derek? Do you think we can really build something better here?" Derek wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I think it's going to take time. But yeah, I think it's possible." That weekend, the neighborhood gathering took place in the Martins' backyard. It was a smaller, quieter affair than their previous attempts, but this time, the atmosphere felt different, warmer, more genuine. Derek and Karen welcomed each neighbor personally as they arrived, offering hot cocoa and homemade cookies. Sam and Tyler played with the other kids, laughter filling the crisp winter air. As the afternoon wore on, Emily arrived with George, who walked slowly, leaning on his cane. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was a tentative softness in his eyes, a willingness to be present, even if he wasn't ready to fully engage. Derek caught George's eye across the yard, offering a nod of acknowledgement. To his surprise, George nodded back, a gesture that felt like a first step towards something new. Angela led the neighbors in a discussion about ways they could support each other through the winter, from shoveling snow to checking in on the elderly residents. Derek noticed that the mood seemed lighter, less fraught with tension, and he felt a small glimmer of hope take root in his chest. As the gathering came to an end and the last of the neighbors drifted away, George lingered for a moment, standing beside Emily. He glanced at Derek, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Thanks for letting me be here," he muttered. Derek offered a small, genuine smile. "We're all part of this community, George. It's not always easy, but we can figure it out together." George said nothing more, but he gave a faint nod before turning to leave, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Derek watched him go, feeling cautious optimism settle into his bones. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And as Derek joined Karen and the kids inside, he felt a sense of relief, knowing that the darkest days might finally be behind them. The days following the neighborhood gathering were surprisingly peaceful. For the first time in months, Derek and Karen felt like they could breathe without the constant weight of suspicion pressing down on them. But there were still moments of doubt. Times when Derek caught Karen staring out the window, her face tight with lingering worry. or when Samantha asked if they'd have to move again if things got bad. Derek knew that true peace would take time. It was one thing for a few neighbors to attend a gathering. It was another for the wounds of the past to heal. And while George had made a small step toward reconciliation, Derek couldn't forget the harm he had caused. One chilly afternoon, as Derek was raking leaves in the front yard, he spotted George standing across the street. The old man hesitated, then began walking over, his cane tapping against the pavement. Derek paused, resting the rake against the fence, bracing himself for whatever conversation might follow. When George reached the edge of the yard, he stopped, taking a deep breath that fogged in the cold air. "Derek," he began, his voice rough and uncertain, "I know I've caused trouble for you and your family, and I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted to try to make things right." Derek studied George's face, noting the lines of exhaustion and the shadows under his eyes. He saw the sincerity there, even if it was tangled with guilt and regret. "What do you have in mind, George?" George shifted uncomfortably, leaning on his cane. "I've been talking to Emily about organizing a proper apology. To the whole neighborhood, not just to you. She thinks it might help if I own up to what I've done." Derek's eyebrows raised in surprise, but he nodded slowly. "That's a big step, George. Are you ready for that?" George shrugged, a small, bitter smile crossing his lips. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but Emily's right. It's time I face what I did." Derek's expression softened, and he extended a hand. "If you're serious about this, I'll stand with you. But this is just the beginning. It's going to take a lot more than words to fix things." George glanced at Derek's outstretched hand, hesitating for a long moment before shaking it. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." A week later, the apology meeting was set up at the community center, an event that Derek and Emily had worked hard to organize, with Angela's help. The turnout was larger than expected, with many neighbors arriving out of curiosity or a desire to see what George had to say. Some of them still eyed Derek with caution, but he could see that others, like Linda and the Jensens, were beginning to soften. The Martins sat in the front row, while George took the stage, looking older and frailer than ever. He clutched the sides of the podium, his hands shaking slightly, and cleared his throat. Emily stood beside him, offering a supportive nod. George's voice trembled as he began to speak, but he forced himself to meet the eyes of the people in the room. "I know most of you here have known me a long time. I've lived in Cedar Ridge for 35 years. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good, and I let those changes scare me." He paused, glancing toward Derek and Karen before continuing. "When the Martins moved in, I made assumptions, ugly ones. I spread lies. I let my fear turn me into something I'm not proud of, and I owe them, and all of you, an apology." A murmur ran through the crowd, some people exchanging surprised glances. Derek saw Karen reach for his hand, her fingers cold and tight around his, and he squeezed back, offering her a small, reassuring smile. George swallowed hard, struggling with the words. "I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix the damage I've done, but I'm asking for a chance to start over, to be better." For a moment, the room was silent, and George's shoulders slumped as if he expected rejection. But then Angela stood up, crossing her arms with a determined look. "You've done a lot of harm, George, but if you're willing to change, then maybe we can find a way forward. What do you all think?" Derek scanned the faces of the neighbors, seeing a range of emotions, skepticism, anger, but also a flicker of hope. Linda and Tom nodded slowly, and a few others began to murmur in agreement. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. George met Derek's gaze across the room, a look of gratitude and uncertainty in his eyes. Derek nodded once, letting him know that he was willing to try, even if he wasn't ready to forget. After the apology, a new energy settled over Cedar Ridge, tentative but real. George began attending neighborhood meetings again, this time as a quiet participant rather than the loud voice of dissent. He even helped organize a winter food drive, something that Derek and Karen gladly volunteered for, wanting to set an example of unity. One snowy morning, as Derek loaded bags of canned goods into the back of his car, George joined him, handing over a few donations of his own. I never thought I'd be doing this, George muttered, a self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. Derek chuckled softly, glancing sideways at him. You and me both, George. But here we are. They worked in silence for a while, the cold air stinging their faces, but there was a sense of mutual respect in their shared effort. When they finished, George hesitated, then clapped Derek on the shoulder. I appreciate you giving me a chance, Derek. I know I didn't make it easy. Derek's expression softened, and he offered a faint smile. No, you didn't. But I think we both have a lot to learn. Let's see where this goes. As George nodded, a small spark of hope lit in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it felt like the beginning of something real. Winter deepened, bringing cold nights and snow-covered mornings. The Martins continued to face moments of unease, but now those moments were tempered by new friendships that began to take root. Angela invited Karen and the kids over for a baking day, where they laughed together over burned cookies and too sweet frosting. The Jensens offered to help Derek with a repair in their garage, sharing stories about the neighborhood's history as they worked. Sam and Tyler, too, began to find their place. Sam joined the school's dance team, and Tyler made friends with a boy from his class, spending snowy afternoons building forts in the backyard. The echoes of their laughter began to sound like a promise of better days. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Karen and Derek sat together by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa. Karen rested her head on Derek's shoulder, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Do you think we're really starting to belong here? She asked softly. Derek wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. I think so. It's not perfect, and it never will be. But I think people are starting to see who we really are, not just the stories they've been told. Karen smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I'm glad we stayed, Derek, even when it was hard. Derek kissed her temple, his voice gentle. Me too, Karen. Me too. As Christmas approached, Emily and Angela suggested that the neighborhood organize a holiday block party, one that would bring everyone together for the first time since the Martins moved in. It was an ambitious plan, but Derek and Karen threw themselves into the preparations, hoping that the event could be a turning point for Cedar Ridge. On the night of the party, the street came alive with twinkling lights and the scent of hot cider. The Martins' front yard was transformed into a winter wonderland, with a bonfire crackling in the center and tables piled high with cookies and cocoa. Neighbors who had once avoided them now mingled freely, sharing stories and laughter as they warmed their hands by the fire. George arrived with Emily, and though he stayed mostly to the edges of the gathering, he made a point of speaking to each person he had once alienated, offering awkward but sincere apologies. To Derek's surprise, many of them responded with kindness, even if they were still wary. Derek watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. It wasn't the same as before. There were still scars that would take time to heal, but it felt like the neighborhood was finding a new rhythm, one built on acceptance rather than suspicion. As the evening wore on, George approached Derek and Karen, clearing his throat awkwardly. I wanted to thank you both for not giving up on me, or on this place. Karen gave him a warm smile, the tension in her shoulders easing as she spoke. Thank you for trying, George. That's all we ever wanted. George nodded, then turned to watch as the kids chased each other through the snow, their laughter filling the air. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile a real, unguarded smile. The holiday party marked a turning point for the entire community, and as winter gave way to the early days of spring, Cedar Ridge began to feel like a different place. Derek continued his work at the local police department, now seeing familiar faces in the streets and shops. Karen joined the PTA at the kids' school, helping to organize fundraisers and school events. George, too, made an effort to rebuild his life. With Emily's support, he continued seeing a counselor, working through the grief and bitterness that had haunted him for so long. He even began attending the book club that Angela hosted, surprising everyone with his dry humor and thoughtful insights. One sunny afternoon, as the first buds of spring began to bloom, Derek found George working in his yard, planting a small flower bed beside the porch. He paused in his work to wave Derek over, and they shared a quiet moment watching the kids play tag on the sidewalk. You know, George said, his voice rough but earnest, I never thought I'd see this place change. But maybe change isn't so bad after all. Derek nodded, feeling a sense of peace settled into his chest. Yeah, maybe it's just what we needed. They stood together for a while longer, two men who had once been enemies, now sharing the quiet hope that the future might hold something better. One warm evening in early April, the Martins sat on their porch, watching the sunset turn the sky shades of pink and gold. Tyler and Sam played catch on the lawn, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. Karen leaned against Derek's shoulder, her smile soft and content. You know, for a while I thought we'd never get to this point, that it would always be a fight. Derek wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. I did too, but we stuck it out. And now, it feels like home. Karen nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Yeah, it really does. As the last light of day faded, Derek felt a sense of gratitude swell in his chest, for the strength it had taken to endure, for the friends they had found along the way, and for the chance to build something new in a place where they had once been strangers. And across the street, George sat on his porch, watching the same sunset, his heart a little lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, it felt like Cedar Ridge was truly theirs, each of them finding their place in a neighborhood that had learned to bend rather than break in the face of change. April's warmth melted into May, and Cedar Ridge came alive with the colors of blooming flowers and the scent of fresh-cut grass. The Martins' home, once a place of tension and uncertainty, had transformed into a hub of laughter, friendship, and hope. For Derek and Karen, the changing season mirrored the changes in their own lives, a time for new beginnings and reflection. One Saturday morning, Derek woke early, slipping out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. He sat down in the old rocking chair that Karen had picked up at a yard sale, watching the sunlight filter through the branches of the maple tree in their front yard. Across the street, George was doing the same, leaning back in his own chair, a newspaper balanced on his knee. Derek considered the man for a moment, then lifted a hand in a wave. George hesitated, but after a moment, he returned the gesture with a faint smile. It was a small, quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had shared, a reminder of how far they'd come. Just then, the door creaked open behind Derek, and Karen stepped out, carrying a basket of freshly baked muffins. She handed one to him, then took a seat beside him, her expression serene. You know, she said, taking a bite, I used to hate mornings like this. Thought they were too quiet, but now I think I've come to appreciate them. Derek smiled, savoring the warmth of the muffin and the gentle hum of the neighborhood around them. Yeah, it's funny how things change, isn't it? Karen leaned her head against his shoulder, gazing out at the street where Sam and Tyler had joined a few other kids for a game of hopscotch. Do you think we'll always be welcome here, Derek? Even when things aren't perfect? Derek glanced at the children playing, at the neighbors chatting as they walked their dogs, and then back to George, who was watching the scene with a thoughtful expression. I think we've all learned that perfect isn't what makes a place home. It's the people, the effort we put into making it better. Karen smiled, and they sat together in the quiet morning light, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they had built something worth holding on to. Later that month, Angela suggested a new project for the neighborhood, a community garden in the empty lot near the playground. She enlisted Derek's help, and together they rallied support from other residents. Even George, once known for his opposition to any change, showed up with a shovel in hand, ready to dig. On the first day of planting, the Martins, along with half a dozen other families, gathered in the lot, turning over soil and marking out rows for vegetables and flowers. Karen and Sam worked on planting tomatoes, while Tyler and his new friend Joey took charge of watering the seeds. As Derek helped George lift a bag of mulch, George gave him a sideways glance, a hint of self-deprecation in his voice. Never thought I'd see myself doing this. Guess you're rubbing off on me, Martin. Derek chuckled, brushing the dirt from his hands. Well, I'll take that as a compliment, George, and it's good to see you out here. George grunted, but there was a hint of a smile in his eyes. Yeah, well, Emily says it's good for me. Keeps me out of trouble. They worked side by side, the rhythm of the shovels and the laughter of children filling the air. As the sun climbed higher, Derek took a moment to look around at the group. Neighbors who had once been strangers, now coming together to build something new. He felt a swell of pride, knowing that they had all played a part in turning Cedar Ridge into a place worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, Derek and Karen continued to find ways to strengthen the ties they had built. Karen organized a book club with Angela and a few of the other women in the neighborhood, while Derek joined a local basketball league with Tom Jensen and a couple of the younger dads. They still encountered moments of friction, but the wounds that had once run so deep now seemed to be healing. One afternoon, as Derek was working in his garage, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find George standing at the entrance, looking more hesitant than usual. He held something wrapped in a plain cloth, cradled carefully in his hands. Derek raised an eyebrow, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Hey, George, what's that you've got?" George shifted uncomfortably, then held out the bundle. "It's something that belonged to my wife, Susan. She always loved the idea of making a home feel warm, welcoming. I thought maybe it'd mean more in your house now." Derek unwrapped the cloth to reveal an old, beautifully crafted wooden wind chime, the kind that sang softly with the breeze. He felt a lump rise in his throat, touched by the unexpected gesture. "George, I don't know what to say." George shrugged, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't have to say anything. Just take care of it, like you've taken care of everything else around here." Derek nodded, feeling a genuine warmth for the first time between them. He reached out, clapping George on the shoulder. "Thank you, George. It means a lot." As George turned to leave, Derek hung the wind chime on the front porch where it caught the afternoon breeze. Its gentle song filled the air, a symbol of a past that had been laid to rest and a future that felt a little brighter. In late June, on the anniversary of the Martins' move to Cedar Ridge, they decided to host a dinner party for their closest friends and allies in the neighborhood. It was a small, intimate gathering, with Angela and her husband, the Jensens, Emily, and even George among the guests. The evening was warm, the kind where fireflies danced through the twilight and the air smelled of fresh grass. They dined outside under the glow of string lights, sharing stories and memories of the year that had brought them all together. At one point, Emily raised a glass, her smile bright despite the lingering sadness in her eyes. "To my uncle, and to all of us. We've come a long way, and I think he'd be proud of what we've built here." George glanced down at his glass, his expression softened by the flickering candlelight. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat. "And to the Martins, for sticking with us when most would have walked away." Derek and Karen exchanged a glance, then raised their own glasses. "To Cedar Ridge," Karen said with a smile, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "And to the future we're building, together." As they clinked glasses, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the soft notes of the wind chime across the yard. Derek looked around at the faces gathered around the table, feeling a deep sense of belonging. For the first time, he truly believed that this place could be their home, not because it was perfect, but because they had made it their own. In early July, as the 4th of July celebrations drew near, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. Derek and Karen helped organize a parade for the kids, while Angela coordinated a fireworks display in the park. Even George pitched in, helping set up tables for the community potluck. The Martins' front yard became a gathering place for the event, with neighbors spreading blankets on the grass to watch the fireworks. As the first rockets burst into the night sky, painting the darkness with brilliant colors, Derek and Karen sat side by side, their hands intertwined. Karen glanced at Derek, her face illuminated by the glow of the fireworks. "Remember when we thought this place would never accept us?" Derek chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Yeah, I remember thinking that maybe we'd made the biggest mistake of our lives." "And now?" Karen asked softly, her eyes reflecting the light of the celebration. Derek looked out at the faces of their friends, Angela laughing with Linda, Emily helping George settle into a chair, the kids playing tag in the glow of the sparklers. He felt a sense of peace settle deep in his chest, a certainty that had been hard-won. "Now I think we made the best decision we could have," he replied, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Karen leaned in to kiss him, a gentle, lingering kiss that spoke of love and hope. As they held each other, the fireworks crackling overhead, they knew that their journey in Cedar Ridge wasn't over, but it was a journey they would face together, with the support of the community they had come to cherish. As the final days of summer faded into a golden haze, the Martins settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by the tension of the past, but by the simple joys of everyday life. They spent their weekends tending to the community garden, hosting barbecues, and making plans for the future. One afternoon, as Derek and Karen sat on their porch watching the sunset, George came over, carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies. He handed them over without ceremony, then settled into a chair beside them. "Figured it was time I returned the favor," he said gruffly, his tone carrying a hint of humor. Karen smiled, breaking a cookie in half and handing a piece to Derek. "Thank you, George. It means a lot." They sat together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, the breeze carrying the soft music of the wind chime. And as they talked about nothing and everything, the silence between them felt like a promise that no matter what the future held, they had found something worth holding on to. For the first time, the Martins truly believed that Cedar Ridge was where they were meant to be. And as they watched the stars come out, they knew that they had not just found a house, but a home, built with patience, resilience, and the kind of love that could overcome even the darkest days. The weeks after the 4th of July celebration marked a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of Cedar Ridge. The Martins' house became a center of activity, a place where neighbors knew they could stop by for a cup of coffee or borrow a tool. Children played freely between yards, their voices ringing out with the joy of summer. The sense of unease that had once lingered between houses like an unwelcome shadow was now replaced by a warmth that spread from home to home. Derek and Karen found themselves busier than ever, hosting game nights, helping with community projects, and even organizing a local charity drive for the nearby elementary school. Karen, whose friendships with the other moms had grown steadily, often hosted weekend brunches, filling the house with the sound of laughter and clinking cups. One evening, Angela, Linda, and a few other neighbors gathered around Karen in the Martins' kitchen, the air thick with the scent of freshly baked pies. They chatted about the kids' upcoming school year and the best spots for hiking nearby. At one point, Angela raised her glass, her eyes glinting with humor. "Here's to the Martins, who taught us all a little something about sticking it out, and to neighbors who finally learned to get along." Laughter filled the room and Karen blushed, but joined in, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As she looked around the kitchen, seeing the friendships that had been forged through adversity, she knew that the struggles of the past year had been worth it. George, too, found himself adjusting to a new role in the neighborhood. No longer the lone guardian of Cedar Ridge's past, he became a quieter but steady presence, one who still held his opinions, but no longer wielded them like a weapon. He attended the neighborhood meetings, but now his voice was one among many, offering practical advice rather than barbed comments. One afternoon, as Derek repaired a broken fence post between their yards, George shuffled over with a toolbox in hand. "Need a hand?" he asked. His tone was as gruff as ever, but Derek could see sincerity in his eyes. Derek nodded, stepping back to let George take a look. "Sure, I could use the help. This post has been giving me trouble for a while." They worked side by side, the sun warm on their backs, sharing a comfortable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. George told stories about Cedar Ridge from decades past, how the block used to be farmland, how he and his late wife Susan had planted the first trees on their street. Derek listened, realizing how much he had never known about the place they now called home. As they finished the repair, George wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing at Derek. "You know, Martin, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you didn't give up on this place, or on me." Derek paused, resting an arm on the newly set post, his smile genuine. "I'm glad you didn't either, George. It's been a long road, but I think we're all better off for it." George nodded, and though he didn't say more, Derek could see the relief in his expression, relief that he no longer had to fight against the changes that had once seemed so threatening. As autumn rolled in, bringing cooler nights and the crunch of fallen leaves, Derek and Karen prepared for one more challenge, a school board meeting, where concerns about the changes in Cedar Ridge would be addressed. George's past rumors still lingered in the minds of some residents, and Derek knew that there would be those who still questioned their place in the community. On the night of the meeting, Derek and Karen arrived at the town hall, nerves buzzing beneath their calm facades. They were greeted by familiar faces, Angela, Tom, and Jean Jensen, Emily, and even George, who stood beside his niece with a determined set to his jaw. Inside, the meeting began with the usual formalities, but when the topic turned to the recent changes in the neighborhood, a man named Jack, one of George's old friends, stood up to speak. "I've lived here for 30 years, and I've seen how things have shifted. Some of us still feel like this isn't the same place we moved into, and we're not sure that's a good thing." Derek braced himself, but before he could respond, George raised his hand. The moderator nodded, and George cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the room. "Jack, I get where you're coming from. I felt the same way. I was scared that things were changing too fast, but I was wrong." The crowd murmured in surprise, and George continued, his gaze steady. "The Martins didn't come here to change everything. They came here to build a life like the rest of us. And if you ask me, they've done more to bring this neighborhood together than I ever did." George glanced at Derek and Karen, offering them a nod of acknowledgement. "They showed me that change doesn't have to mean losing what we love about this place. It can mean finding new things to love. And I think it's time we stop holding on to old grudges." Derek felt a surge of gratitude swell in his chest as he watched the expressions of the other residents soften, some nodding thoughtfully. When he stood to speak, he kept his words brief, letting George's message resonate. "We've all had our share of struggles, but we're here now, and we want to be part of this community for the long haul." When the meeting ended, Derek and Karen received handshakes, pats on the back, and even a few apologies from neighbors who had once kept their distance. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it felt like a major step forward, a sign that the wounds of the past were beginning to heal. By October, the community garden had flourished, and the Martins joined Angela, George, and other neighbors in organizing a harvest festival to celebrate the season. It was a simple affair, with homemade pies, warm cider, and a small hay bale maze for the kids. The festival felt like a culmination of everything they had worked for, a moment of unity that had once seemed impossible. George manned a small booth with Emily, selling jars of apple butter made from the trees he'd tended over the years. Karen joined the other moms in overseeing a pumpkin carving contest, while Derek played referee for the kids' three-legged race. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Derek stood beside George, looking out over the gathering. The air was filled with laughter and music, the bonfire crackling at the center of the field. George took a deep breath, his expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. "You know, I thought I was protecting this place, keeping it the way it used to be. But maybe I was just afraid of losing something I couldn't get back." Derek nodded, his own voice tinged with reflection. "I get that. But sometimes you find new things worth holding on to." George met Derek's gaze, and a small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Guess we're all learning, huh?" They stood together in the cool autumn air, watching as Karen led the kids to a round of ghost stories, the glow of the bonfire lighting up her smile. For a moment, all the struggles and doubts seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of a community that had learned to embrace its differences. The first snowfall of December blanketed Cedar Ridge, turning the neighborhood into a postcard-perfect scene. The Martins' house glowed with Christmas lights, and the front yard was decorated with a snowman that Sam and Tyler had built, its carrot nose slightly crooked. One evening, as they prepared for the holidays, Derek and Karen found themselves on the porch, sipping hot chocolate and watching the snowfall. The wind chime that George had given them swayed gently, its soft music filling the quiet night. "I think we've finally made it, Derek," Karen said, her voice hushed with awe. "We've found our place." Derek wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close against the winter chill. "Yeah, it feels like home now." Karen looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I wouldn't trade it for anything." Derek kissed her forehead, savoring the moment. As they stood together, watching the snowflakes drift down, they knew that their journey hadn't been easy, that it had been filled with pain, uncertainty, and hard-won lessons. But it had also brought them a sense of belonging that they had never known before. Across the street, George sat on his porch, bundled in a thick coat, a small smile playing at his lips as he watched the Martins. He raised a hand in a quiet wave, and Derek and Karen waved back, feeling a warmth that no winter chill could touch. And as the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the distance, they knew that this was where they were meant to be, together in a place they had fought for, a place that had become their home. As the final scene fades out and the Martins enjoy the peaceful snow-covered cedar ridge from their porch, the camera pans up to the twinkling Christmas lights in the quiet starry sky. Narrator. In life, finding a place where you truly belong can be a difficult journey, full of unexpected challenges and hard-earned victories. But sometimes the most rewarding paths are the ones we never expected to take. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, hope, and the power of community, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories that remind us all that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for a new beginning. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one. The screen fades to the channel's logo. Then a simple and inviting end screen appears with a button for subscribing, along with recommendations for other heartwarming stories.